Today's recording was very exceptional. It was not only some great music that was picked out by the musicians there that we worked with or listened to when the different sessions were you know, kind of cut in half. We had one band and another band. And just the whole carefree, fun atmosphere that isn't on every recording date you come to these days. There's a lot of clock watching and a lot of pressure, and a lot of things are just well, not as fun as today's date, to put it nicely. And I thought there was a lot of good fun, a lot of good jazz. So the society should have a lot of fun with this CD.
When you hear this performance, it is really great. And Sidney, I know, was a blues player from the heart, you know, and that's what he liked to play. He was, you know, above all the music that he played, you know, the blues was his favorite music. And Eric, the thing you speak about, the first thing you say about him playing the blues.
Yes.
And it's he loved it, you know.
Yes.
And whether it was fast or slow, you know. And when it came to fast and fire, there was one of the most unique thing about him as a performer. You know, Sidney had this fire that the reed players, particular clarinet and soprano players, would not have. Mm-hmm. You know, and the horn he had in those days, it was very difficult to play that horn in tune. And he played it like it was just a toy, just like it was nothing to it, you know. And so you had to honor him. So we are honoring him today for the reason of the recognition of what he could do and what he left behind. And it's a great day.
1, 2. I think it's absolutely wonderful that there's a Sidney Bechet Society. Bechet was one of the great figures of the 20th century, one of the most important jazz men in the entire history of the music. I had the privilege of meeting Sidney for the first time. I think I met him in 1949 in Paris. I think I first met Sidney. No, I know exactly when I first met Sidney Bechet. I played with him. And I had been playing with Max Kaminsky and Pee Wee Russell and Miff Mole in 1948 in Boston. And shortly after that, I was in Philadelphia with a friend of mine from the Army, and there was a concert in Philadelphia at the major hall there. It was in a side room. And it was a lovely concert with Sidney Bechet and Max Kaminsky, and James P. Johnson was supposed to be there on piano, but he didn't show up. And Maxie saw me in the audience, and I had played with him, so they asked me to come up and play the concert right out of the audience. And I was a little afraid, because at that time Bechet was such an imposing figure. I had never played with him, and I never met him. And he was very kind to me that day, because I didn't. He played songs that I knew, and Maxie knew the songs. And if he called a tune that I'd never played with him, my ear just sort of carried me through. But Sidney was very kind, and I didn't get a chance to talk to him much that day, but I played the whole concert. I never forgot it, and I don't know whether Sidney forgot it. I didn't know him paying much attention. But I saw him again in Paris when I went there, and then he came to Storyville. And it was a very moving experience when he came to Storyville, because he got sick. And he went to the Mass General Hospital, which was the finest hospital in the world. And I tell this story this way because it shows how minds work in different phases of your life. He had the finest doctors in the world. He had a problem, an ulcer or something, and he needed an operation. And I sent my wife, who was my girlfriend at that time. We were engaged. We weren't engaged, but we were going together, and she was working in cancer research at the Mass General. So she went back to see him just so that he would feel comfortable that somebody knew him, and he said he wanted to go back to Paris for the operation. So here he leaves the greatest hospital in the world, Massachusetts General, Harvard Medical School, to go back to Paris, where the doctors are fine and there's no problem with them. But that was his heart, was Paris. He was not at home in the United States of America. Then I saw Sidney occasionally, and I brought him back to the club again, and that's when I recorded with him the first time. And we had scheduled, that time I had Storyville Records, and we had scheduled a recording session Sunday afternoon. Claude Hopkins, Vic Dickinson, Buzzy Druten, Jimmy Wood, and Sidney Bechet. So Claude Hopkins forgets there's a Sunday afternoon session. Buzzy Druten says that I drugged Claude Hopkins so he'd sleep so I could play. It wasn't true, but I would have done it if I thought of it, but it was absolutely not true. And so I jumped in and did the recording session, and it happened to be one of the most enjoyable things I ever did, and one of the best piano solos I ever played in all the years was, I noticed, because I forget, but they made a CD of it in Paris. And I heard this chorus I did, "Lady Be Good," and Sidney is goosing me, "Go George, go George." I mean, it was just wonderful, and I was going. I mean, I heard that record a few months ago. I hadn't heard it in years, and I couldn't believe it. I says, "You mean I can play like that?" Because I can't play like that now. I mean, I don't have the hands. Not that it was such great music, but it was fast. So. I don't want to play trio, that's for sure. So who wants to play? Bob, you want to play quartet with me? Yeah, why don't you come up and play, then we'll do one tune with you, and we'll do one tune with somebody else. That's all. So then I asked Sidney to go to the Brussels World's Fair, and I called I discussed the band with Sidney, you know, what about Buck Clayton, what about Vic, what about Kansas Fields, what about Arvell Shaw, and he approved all of them. And of course the best choice was Buck, because Buck was a trumpet player that knew how to play with Sidney. And Sidney liked to play the lead, everybody knows that, and any trumpet player that challenged him got in trouble. I mean, literally, nearly would come to blows. But Buck would find the, either a third, I guess he'd find a third above, he'd play the equivalent of what the clarinet part might have been, or the saxophone part might have been with someone else. And that week just went so beautifully. We made an album there, we got 5 stars in downbeat, and it is amazing the influence of an album you do. There was a poet, Hayden Carruth. Do you know Hayden Carruth? Hayden Carruth's a very fine poet. He's a man about 78 years old, and he wrote a poem. And one of the things that moved him, he was a political poet, but he loved jazz. And he talked about the Belgians, and then bringing Vic Dickinson, Bechet, and Clayton to Brussels, and he was comparing the Belgians, the way they treated the Africans in the Belgian Congo, and that they didn't understand anything, and they're listening to that great music, and they still didn't understand. And this one album, he never saw Vic and Bechet, and he wrote it where Vic Dickinson used to do something where he played very low on the trombone in a blues and society blues, you hear, and it's like he farted in the faces of the Belgians, who for some reason or other Hayden had a real problem with, and Bechet laughed, and he made this whole thing into a sociological statement. And I read that in the poem. I couldn't believe it, and because I didn't know this man. And I read this poem, and I says, he never saw him in person. And you make an album, and it affects a person's entire life, and you don't realize it. And so I was very excited about that when I read it, and that album was a great album. And Vic played beautifully, and Sidney played beautifully, and again I can hear him goosing me in this album, you know, go George, you know. And it got 5 stars in downbeat. And that was the last album Sidney recorded. And he got cancer, and it's a terrible thing, that cancer. I have a very close friend of mine who's dying right now of cancer. She may not last the next 2 days. And I'm going to the hospital right from here to see her. And all it will do will remind me of seeing Sidney on his deathbed. And Sidney could still talk. Marie can't talk at this point. And I said, Sidney, is there anything I can do for you? I didn't want to go. I don't like to go to hospitals. But Charles Delaunay said, please come. Sidney would like to see you. And I said, Sidney, is there anything I can do for you? He says, George, I want to go home. I've been pondering that for all these years, what he meant by home. He was in his home in Paris. He'd lived there for years. I didn't know whether he wanted to go to a spiritual home or go back to America, which was his native home. I still don't know what he meant by that, but he wanted to go home. Those are the last words that Sidney Bechet said to me, and might have been very close to his last words.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
working and playing for and at Jazz at Lincoln Center, it's a great thing, because what we're trying to do there is to preserve jazz and give it its proper place in American history, you know, with it being America's original art form. And to come here to the studio today to do this Sidney Bechet recording is very special for me, in the sense that my introduction to jazz when I was 12 years old was by another great New Orleans musician, Louis Armstrong. And you can't really talk about Louis Armstrong without thinking about, you know, Sidney Bechet. So to do this recording, it's really great for me, because I don't get a chance to play New Orleans style jazz very often. A lot of times working at Lincoln Center, we play big band music and we do concerts to display, you know, the New Orleans style. We do the various forms of jazz. But again, this was my introduction to jazz, and it is so close to me. So any chance I get the opportunity to come and play this style of music, it's I just jump on it. Big studio, small studio, Lincoln Center, it does not matter. The younger generation's appreciation for the style of music, I think, is slowly but surely coming back. And I would like to think that I'm a part of the younger generation, or if not, definitely in touch with them. But, you know, in my generation, in terms of playing jazz, our exposure pretty much came up, and even in the school situations, be it college, high school, or whatever, we tend to start, or to want to start with the bebop era, and to not go and deal with the whole history of jazz. And I think now a lot of the younger generation, they're becoming exposed, and rather than taking the view that we've always taken, well, that's the old style jazz. The music is just as modern today as it was then, because it's still fun to play. It's also hard to play, and it takes discipline to learn to play this music. So I think that our generation is coming around and seeing that it's very important to learn to play the New Orleans style jazz. I mean, those guys like Sidney Bechet and Louis Armstrong, they had great melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic content, which makes up all of the other styles of music that they like, that we all like to play. And you know, what better example, you know, than some of those guys. And then I guess the greatest achievement that we can have in jazz as individual musicians is to be able to display our individual personalities. And then again, you're dealing with Sidney Bechet, who sounds like that. You know, that's a great achievement. And I think that Sidney Bechet knew that, and that once the musicians of my generation grasp the idea of that, they see the importance that, you know, guys like Miles Davis, they all came out of Louis Armstrong, Clifford Brown, all the saxophone players. The guy Johnny Hodges, that you know, he learned, he didn't play like Sidney Bechet, but Sidney Bechet influenced him greatly, and you know, that's important. Well, this session today is special, because most of the guys I've only played with, maybe some in just one sitting, some 3 or 4, and some we run into each other all the time, and it's always a good thing. I was telling a friend of mine that it's good to see and to be able to interact with an organization that upholds the music that I started listening to, and not just because I started listening to it, because it's important in the history of jazz. So this recording today, I think, is definitely a great thing. Honoring Sidney Bechet, I mean, you couldn't pick a better musician to honor and to uphold. I mean, it's in his sound, and I'm glad to be selected by you all to have taken part in that.
Yeah, right. Again, I go back playing this music back in high school in the early 50s and played at college in the mid 50s. And my first trip to Europe occurred in the summer of 1955. We went over with a jazz band, and I met Sidney in France at the time. I went back to France. Of course, he died in 1959. But when I went back again, it was 1963, and I worked a lot with Mez Mesro Jr., and of course Mez was over there in Europe at the time. So I have my connections with this music really go back to really my high school days. And then, as you know, I got to later on to co-own and manage and play at Eddie Condon's nightclub for 10 years in New York, pretty much playing this kind of music. So it's been my life. I think one of my earlier influences, among others, was Muggsy Spanier, who, with that wonderful driving, muted style, played some memorable recording sessions with Sidney. And I've always considered myself a rhythmic horn player based on that great pulse that both Sidney and Muggsy had. And of course, Sidney was a great lead player as well as a harmonic player, so it was a very interesting duality going there. It was always a nice tension that went on, I think, with Sidney and the cornet players or trumpet players, because the timbre of both those instruments is very close, and it's a real challenge to. And likewise, this recording session, working with Bob Wilber, the two of us together, you find us going in and out, getting very close to each other, and then pulling away. It's very interesting. And it's a pleasure to be associated with this recording. As you know, I have appeared a couple of times for the Society in, I'd say, Sidney-related concerts, but in a broader spectrum. He was connected with 52nd Street and during its glory years, and we're going to be doing another concert, Magic of Swing Street. And I just think it's very important that we do these kind of concerts, and I think it's great having some younger players and having a mix of styles. Not saying we're just copying the music of Sidney. We're playing it today as a live music. I've always considered classic jazz to be a very valid art form, regardless of whether you're classified as being a traditional player or modern. It's the critics who put the names on it. I think that it's all important and is ongoing. It's like realism in painting versus impressionism. There's always room for the realists and the impressionists. So it's a direct parallel, and I think it's an important occasion to get this recorded on CDs. I'm glad to be a part of it.
Thank you, Eric, and I'm very honored to be asked to participate in this first CD recording of the Bechet Society, and the work of the Society in keeping the name and spreading the name of the great Sidney Bechet is very important, because when I first met Sidney in the late 40s, he was sort of a forgotten figure in jazz, and he was sort of contemplating a sort of a semi-retirement where he would run a school of music at his home in Brooklyn and play an occasional concert with Eddie Condon or somebody of that sort. But he never was a big name in jazz in the United States at all before that. And what happened to him in the last 10 years of his life was an amazing sort of miracle that I don't think Sidney quite believed himself could have happened. He went to Paris in 1949 for the second International Jazz Festival and was an overnight smash sensation, a hit. He spent the last 10 years of his life making records that sold in the millions. He was a pop figure. The man in the street in France knew Sidney Bechet. He would go to work with his lunch pail whistling a Sidney Bechet song. It was an amazing, triumphant end to a very up and down career. I discovered Sidney when I was still a kid in high school, when I went to the record store and saw a new recording by Sidney Bechet and his New Orleans Feet Warmers. Sidney Bechet, what a funny name, and I never heard of him. But in those days, of course, you could take the 78 records into the booth and play them, you know. So I played this record, and first thing that struck me was the sound of a soprano sax. I'd never heard a soprano sax before. Heard the tenor and heard the alto, of course the clarinet, and by then I was very conversant with the music of the Swinger, of Benny Goodman and Harry James and Duke Ellington, but this was a new sound. I was equally intrigued at that time with the sound of Charlie Shaver's marvelous trumpet, and Charlie was like 21 years old. This young, very vibrant young musician trading ideas with Sidney, you know. And it was not what we would call New Orleans jazz. It wasn't Dixieland. It was improvised swing music, and Bechet was really a swing musician, you know. Duke Ellington, who of course penned the expression, "It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing," worshipped Sidney Bechet. He said Sidney Bechet is the embodiment of jazz, you know. He's the #1 figure in jazz music. But it was a marvelous experience. After hearing that soprano, I'd started to play clarinet a little bit, but then I picked myself up a soprano and started playing that too. And that magical day when I was at my home in Scarsdale, New York, and the phone rang, and it was Mez Mesro, who I'd befriended while I was still in high school, and that was the first band on 52nd Street I ever sat in with Art Hodes and Mez Mesro. And Mez say, "Hey, Bobby, Bash is opening a school of music at his home in Brooklyn. I know you'd be interested." He used to call him Bash, and Mez sort of affected a southern drawl, although he was from Chicago and was a Jewish gentleman. But he wanted to be identified with black people. It was very important for him. So he told me about it and gave me instructions how to get to this place in the wilds of Sheepshead Bay and set up the appointment with Sidney. So off I went, and after about 3 subway stops and changing to a bus and everything, I finally arrived at Sidney's home, and there outside the home was a sign that said Sidney Bechet School of Music. And it turned out I was the first student. And it turned out that he had not publicized the event in any way except having a friend of his who was a sign painter make up the sign and tack it out outside his door. That was all he ever did. And so he was very complimented that a young musician, and I was, I was 18 at the time, was that interested in his music. He had the feeling that, well, you know, time has passed me by and nobody cares about my kind of music, you know. And so I'll have the school of music and maybe I'll get a few students, you know. So he was very pleased, and he began to teach me. After a month of going there for lessons, he said, "Bobby, why don't you come over here and move in with me, because I'm working on a ballet, and I need somebody to help me write these notes down, you know. So I worked with him on the ballet, slept in the parlor on the couch there, and the lessons were, by then, were daily, and they'd go on for hours, you know. And then when he started working at Jimmy Ryan's, I would go in to work with him, and about midnight, he'd go on for his third or fourth set of the evening, and he always beckoned to me, come on up. And I'd finish the whole night playing with Sidney and the trio. Again, this is a great lesson, you know. Oh, we had some good times together. We used to go up to Harlem after work and go around to the clubs and sit in and have good times. He was a jolly fellow, a good time fellow. He could be very difficult if he felt the musicians weren't carrying their weight. You know, he was a perfectionist, but he also enjoyed having a good time. And when he went off to France, I actually was there at the airport with Walter Schaap. We were seeing Sidney off, and also in that plane going to Paris was Lips Page, Sammy Price, and a couple of younger players, a guy named Miles Davis and a young alto player named Charlie Parker. And the French press, evidently I'd heard, was heralding the fact that Charlie Parker was coming to play in Paris, and this was the great event of jazz. Well, actually, after the first concert, Charlie went on with Miles, and then the second half, Sidney went on. Sidney absolutely broke it up. I wasn't there, but apparently the reception was astounding, you know. From then on, Sidney started going back and really seriously decided to live in France, and ended up dying at the age of, what was he, 63 or something. At the same time, one of his songs, Petit Fleur, was a worldwide hit. Ironically, not his own recording of it, a recording by an English band named Chris Barber. But it was still in all, it was a very triumphant ending for a illustrious career. And he was a marvelous teacher, although he had never really thought about teaching. He had a very definite idea of what the music was about and what he was doing. His first principal student was a young man who came to New York in the early 20s with a little curved soprano sax like the one I played, named Johnny Hodges. And Johnny studied with Sidney and used to sit in, as I did, at Sidney's club in the 20s. And again, Johnny Hodges had that same feeling about Sidney that I have too. So I feel very honored to be one of Sidney's principal students, along with the great Johnny Hodges.
And the greatest Sidney Bechet player today.
Well, you know, I don't try to
Wilber.
I don't try to play like Sidney. I don't try to emulate Sidney. I feel that some of these players, and particularly among the French players, they seem to spend their whole life trying to be Sidney Bechet. Nobody can be Sidney Bechet. He was an absolute original, but he is an inspiration, a continual inspiration for me. They sometimes tend to classify Sidney Bechet as a New Orleans musician. Well, Sidney left New Orleans at the age of 14, I believe it was, and never went back again until 1940. And he was a wandering minstrel. His experience carried him to Chicago, to New York, and then in 1918 he went to Europe with Will Marion Cook's Southern Syncopators. He played for the King in England, and his musical tastes were very varied. He loved his childhood buddy, his music of Louis Armstrong. Clarence Williams was very close to the New Orleans people. But he also listened very avidly to people like Enrico Caruso and Richard Tauber, the operatic. There was an operatic strain in his music. And when he found that soprano sax, he discovered that straight soprano sax in London in 1919. He found his true voice, because he could sing on that soprano much more than he could on the clarinet. So he listened to all kinds of classical music, but principally 19th century romantic music. That was his period. And he would do very complex arrangements which would involve inserting classical pieces. Like he did an arrangement of Dear Old Southland, which in the middle he had the famous clown or aria from Pagliacci. Suddenly he was into that in the middle of Dear Old Southland, but it all seemed to fit with Sidney.
Hey man, this is one of the best recording sessions we've had in a long time.